Picture this. It's 2025. You wake up, check your bank account, scroll through the news. Everything seems normal. The dollar is still the dollar. Stocks are moving. Crypto is buzzing. Life goes on. But behind the curtain, something is happening that almost no one is talking about. Something so massive, so quietly orchestrated, that by the time you realize it, it'll already be done. The United States has a problem. A $38 trillion problem. That's the national debt. $38 trillion. A number so large it doesn't even feel real anymore. If you tried to count to 38 trillion, one number per second, it would take you over 1.2 million years. And here's the thing. No one believes it's getting paid back. Not traditionally, anyway. No politician is campaigning on austerity. No one's cutting Social Security or Medicare. No one's slashing the military budget in half. So how does a country with $38 trillion in debt keep spending, keep borrowing, and somehow not collapse? Here's the secret. They're not paying it back. They're erasing it. Quietly. Strategically. Using a playbook most people don't even know exists. Gold revaluation. Crypto adoption. Inflation as a policy tool. Off-balance sheet maneuvers. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is financial engineering on a scale we've never seen before. And if you're not paying attention, you're going to wake up one day and wonder why your savings feel worthless. Why everything costs twice as much. And why the government's debt somehow doesn't matter anymore. So let me ask you this. What if everything you think you know about debt, money, and financial collapse is wrong? What if the US isn't headed for disaster, but toward the greatest financial reset in human history? And what if you're funding it without even knowing? Before we dive deep into the mechanics of how this is happening, I need you to do something. If you've ever felt like the financial system doesn't make sense anymore, if you've wondered why inflation keeps rising but the economy keeps chugging along, if you've ever asked yourself how a country can owe $38 trillion and still be the most powerful nation on earth, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me if you think the US can actually pull this off. Because what I'm about to show you will change the way you see money forever. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's start with the foundation. Debt. What is it, really? Most people think of debt as a burden. Something you owe. Something you have to pay back. And for you and me, that's exactly what it is. If you borrow money for a car, you pay it back. If you take out a mortgage, you pay it back. If you max out your credit card, you better pay it back or face the consequences. But here's where it gets interesting. When you're the United States of America, debt doesn't work the same way. Because the US controls the currency its debt is denominated in. The dollar. Think about that for a second. Imagine you could borrow money, and then print the exact currency you need to pay it back. That's the game. And it's a game the US has been playing for decades. But here's the problem. You can't just print unlimited money without consequences. If you flood the system with too many dollars, each dollar becomes worth less. That's inflation. And if inflation gets out of control, people lose faith in the currency. Creditors stop lending. The whole system collapses. So the US has to be smart. It can't just print its way out. It has to use more sophisticated tools. Tools that let it reduce the real value of its debt, without triggering a full-blown currency crisis. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Let me give you the first tool in the playbook. Inflation as stealth default. Here's how it works. Let's say the US owes $38 trillion. That debt was borrowed over decades. Some of it at 2% interest. Some at 3%. Some at 5%. But here's the key. That debt is locked in. The US doesn't have to pay more interest just because prices go up. So if inflation runs at 6% per year for a decade, but the debt is locked in at 3%, the real value of that debt is shrinking. Think of it this way. Imagine you owe someone $100,000. But every year, the value of a dollar drops. After 10 years of 5% inflation, that $100,000 feels more like $60,000 in real purchasing power. You still owe the same number of dollars, but those dollars are worth way less. That's exactly what the US is doing. It's letting inflation eat away at the real value of the debt. And who pays for it? You do. Every time your groceries cost more. Every time rent goes up. Every time your paycheck buys less than it used to. That's the hidden tax. Inflation isn't just a side effect. It's the plan. And the Federal Reserve knows it. They talk about bringing inflation down to 2%. But here's the truth. If inflation stays at 3%, 4%, or 5% for years, that's not a failure. That's the strategy. Because every year of elevated inflation is another year the debt becomes less of a burden. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, but won't that destroy the economy? Not necessarily. Because the US isn't just inflating the currency. It's doing something else at the same time. Something that gives the dollar a lifeline. Something that makes the whole plan possible. And that brings us to the second tool. Gold revaluation. Here's a fact most people don't know. The US government owns 8,133 tons of gold. That's more than any other country in the world. And that gold is officially valued on the government's books at $42.22 per ounce. You read that right. $42 per ounce. Even though the market price of gold is over $2,000 per ounce. Why? Because that's the price it was set at back in 1973. And it's never been updated. Now, let me ask you this. What happens if the US decides to revalue its gold? Let's say they market to market at $2,000 per ounce. Suddenly, the US Treasury's gold holdings are worth over $500 billion. Not $11 billion. $500 billion. That's a $489 billion asset boost. Overnight. No new taxes. No new borrowing. Just accounting. But here's where it gets wild. What if gold doesn't stop at $2,000? What if the price keeps climbing? $3,000. $5,000. $10,000 per ounce. Some analysts think that's exactly where it's headed. Because central banks around the world are buying gold at record levels. China is stockpiling it. Russia is stockpiling it. India, Turkey, Poland. Everyone is buying gold. Why? Because they're all preparing for the same thing. A world where the dollar is no longer the undisputed king. And if that happens, if gold becomes the ultimate backstop for currencies again, then the US is sitting on a gold mine. Literally. They could revalue their gold at whatever price makes sense, and use that revaluation to offset a massive chunk of the national debt. Think of it as a magic trick. You owe $38 trillion. But you're also sitting on an asset that could be worth $1 trillion, $2 trillion, or more. You don't pay off the debt. You just revalue your assets. And suddenly the debt-to-asset ratio looks way better. Creditors stay calm. Markets stay stable. And the US buys itself another decade. But gold isn't the only ace up America's sleeve. There's something else. Something newer. Something most governments are still trying to figure out. Crypto. And this is where things get really interesting. Because while everyone's been debating whether Bitcoin is a scam or the future of money, the US has been quietly positioning itself. Let me take you back to 2024. Donald Trump is campaigning for president. And he says something that shocks the financial world. He wants the US to become the crypto capital of the planet. He talks about Bitcoin. He talks about blockchain. He even hints at the idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Now, whether you love Trump or hate him, that statement was a signal. A signal that the US government is no longer treating crypto as a fringe asset. It's treating it as a strategic tool. And here's why that matters. Bitcoin, love it or hate it, is now a $1 trillion asset class. It's traded on major exchanges. It's held by institutional investors. Countries like El Salvador have made it legal tender. And more importantly, it exists outside the traditional banking system. That makes it useful. Not because the US wants to replace the dollar with Bitcoin, but because crypto gives the US optionality. Let me explain. Right now, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. That means most global trade happens in dollars. Oil is priced in dollars. Debt is issued in dollars. Central banks hold dollars as reserves. But that dominance is under threat. China is pushing the yuan. Russia is trading in rubles and gold. The BRICS nations are talking about creating their own currency. So the US needs a plan B. And crypto is part of that plan. Here's how. If the US accumulates a strategic reserve of Bitcoin or other digital assets, it creates a hedge. If the dollar weakens, crypto could rise. If global trade starts shifting away from dollars, the US still has a seat at the table. And here's the kicker. The US already owns a lot of Bitcoin. You probably didn't know this. But the US government has seized hundreds of thousands of Bitcoins over the years. From drug busts. From cybercrime cases. From Silk Road, Bitfinex, and dozens of other investigations. At current prices, that's worth billions. And they're not selling it all. They're holding it. Why? Because they understand what's coming. A world where digital assets matter. A world where owning Bitcoin is like owning digital gold. And if the price of Bitcoin keeps climbing, if it hits $100,000, $200,000, or even higher, then the US is sitting on another massive, unrealized gain. Another asset they can point to and say, look, we're not broke. We're just restructuring. But it's not just about holding crypto. It's about control. Because while Bitcoin gets all the attention, the real game changer is something else. Central bank digital currencies. CBDCs. Digital dollars. This is the endgame. Imagine a world where the dollar is fully digital. No more cash. No more physical bills. Every transaction tracked. Every dollar programmable. The Federal Reserve could control exactly how money flows through the economy. They could set expiration dates on money. They could restrict what you can buy. They could freeze accounts instantly. This isn't science fiction. China already has a digital yuan. Europe is working on a digital euro. And the US is studying it right now. If the US launches a digital dollar, it would be the most powerful financial tool in history. And here's how it ties into debt. With a digital dollar, the government could implement monetary policy in real time. They could inject stimulus directly into people's accounts. They could control inflation with surgical precision. They could even implement negative interest rates, forcing people to spend money or lose it. That kind of control makes managing $38 trillion in debt way easier. Because you're no longer relying on banks or bond markets to implement policy. You're controlling the money supply directly, at the individual level. And if you think that sounds dystopian, you're right. But it's also incredibly effective. From the government's perspective, a digital dollar is the ultimate weapon. It gives them the power to inflate, deflate, tax, and redistribute, all without passing a single law. So when you hear politicians talking about crypto regulation, or the Fed talking about digital currencies, understand what's really happening. They're building the infrastructure for a financial reset. A reset where the old rules don't apply anymore, and where the US can manage its debt, not by paying it back, but by controlling the very nature of money itself. Now, let's talk about the third tool. Off-balance sheet mechanisms. This is where things get technical. But stay with me, because this is how governments hide debt without actually reducing it. Here's the concept. Not all debt shows up on the official balance sheet. There are things called unfunded liabilities. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, government pensions. These are promises the government has made. promises to pay trillions of dollars in the future. But those promises don't count as official debt. They're off the books. Some estimates put unfunded liabilities at over $100 trillion. That's separate from the $38 trillion in official debt. So the real number? It's way higher. But here's the trick. Governments can change those promises. They can raise the retirement age. They can cut benefits. They can means test programs. And when they do that, they reduce future liabilities. Without ever touching the official debt number. It's financial sleight of hand. And it's been happening for years. Another off-balance sheet trick? Quantitative easing. You've probably heard that term. But do you really know what it means? Here's the simple version. The Federal Reserve buys government debt. Trillions of dollars worth. They create money out of thin air. And use it to buy treasury bonds. Now, technically, the Fed is independent from the government. But in reality, the Fed buying government debt is like one pocket lending to the other. The debt still exists. But it's no longer held by private investors or foreign governments. It's held by the Fed. And here's the thing. The Fed doesn't need to be paid back the same way a private investor does. They can hold that debt forever. They can roll it over indefinitely. They can even forgive it if they want to. It's all just accounting. And that's the beauty of controlling your own currency. You can play these games. You can move debt around. You can make it disappear. Not literally, but functionally. Because if no one's demanding repayment, does the debt even matter? This is the question at the heart of modern monetary theory. And love it or hate it, it's exactly what the US is doing right now. They're using the Fed as a pressure valve. When debt gets too high, the Fed steps in, buys bonds, lowers interest rates, keeps the system stable. And the debt, it just keeps growing. But no one panics. Because the Fed is always there. Always ready to intervene. It's the ultimate safety net. And as long as the world believes in it, it works. But here's the problem. This whole system is built on one thing. Trust that the dollar will hold its value. Trust that the US will honor its debts. Trust that the Federal Reserve knows what it's doing. And right now, that trust is being tested. Let me show you why. In 2020, the US response to COVID was unprecedented. Trillions in stimulus. Money printing on a scale never seen before. The Fed's balance sheet exploded from $4 trillion to over $9 trillion. And inflation, it went from under 2% to over 9% in just 2 years. People felt it. Gas prices doubled. Groceries got more expensive. Rent skyrocketed. Suddenly, inflation wasn't just an abstract concept. It was real. And it was painful. Now, the Fed says they've got it under control. They raised interest rates. They cooled the economy. Inflation is coming down. But here's what they're not telling you. The damage is done. Prices didn't go back down. They just stopped rising as fast. Your purchasing power? It's permanently lower. And the debt? It's still growing. Because even with higher interest rates, the government is still spending more than it takes in. Every single year. So the debt keeps climbing. And the only way to manage it is to keep playing the game. Keep inflating. Keep revaluing assets. Keep moving debt off the books. But there's a limit. A point where trust breaks. Where creditors say, enough. Where foreign governments stop buying US debt. Where the dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency. And if that happens, everything changes. Let me paint you a picture of what that looks like. Imagine a world where the dollar is no longer dominant. Oil is no longer priced in dollars. China and Russia trade in their own currencies. The euro, the yuan, maybe even a BRICS currency. They all compete with the dollar. In that world, the US can't just print money without consequences. Because foreign countries aren't holding dollars anymore. They don't need them. And if they don't need them, they can dump them. Sell off their treasury holdings. Crash the bond market. Send interest rates soaring. That's the nightmare scenario. And it's not as far-fetched as you think. Because it's already starting to happen. China has been slowly reducing its holdings of U.S. treasuries. Russia dumped most of its dollar reserves years ago. Saudi Arabia is now open to selling oil in currencies other than the dollar. These are cracks in the foundation. Small cracks. But they're growing. And the U.S. knows it. That's why they're acting now. That's why gold is being quietly repositioned. That's why crypto is suddenly on the table. That's why the Fed is studying digital currencies. Because the old system is dying. And the U.S. needs a new one. A system where they still have control. Where they can still manage the debt. Where they can still be the dominant financial power. But here's the thing. Building that new system requires pain. It requires inflation. It requires asset bubbles. It requires ordinary people to lose purchasing power. Because that's how you erase debt without defaulting. You make the debt smaller in real terms. By making everything else more expensive. And the people who suffer. It's not the government. It's not the banks. It's not the billionaires. It's you. The middle class. The savers. The people who work for a paycheck. Because your wages don't go up as fast as prices. Your savings get eroded by inflation. Your retirement accounts lose real value. You're funding the debt reduction, whether you know it or not. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like a conspiracy. But it's not. It's just economics. It's just how sovereign debt works when you control your own currency. And the U.S. isn't the first country to do this. Every empire in history has played this game. Rome debased its currency. Weimar Germany printed money until it was worthless. More recently, Argentina, Venezuela, Zimbabwe. They all tried to print their way out of debt. And they all failed. But here's the difference. The U.S. is smarter. They're not just printing money recklessly. They're using a sophisticated combination of tools. Inflation, yes. But also asset revaluation. Debt monetization through the Fed. Strategic positioning in gold and crypto. And most importantly, they're doing it slowly. Gradually. So that most people don't even notice. You feel poorer. You feel like things are harder. But you can't quite put your finger on why. And that's the point. If it happens fast, people panic. If it happens slow, people adjust. They accept the new normal. And the system survives. This is the fourth tool in the playbook. Gradualism. The slow boil. You don't cook a frog by throwing it in boiling water. It jumps out. You put it in cool water. And slowly turn up the heat. By the time it realizes what's happening, it's too late. That's what's happening to the middle class right now. The heat is rising. But it's rising slowly enough that most people aren't jumping out. They're just adapting. Working more hours. Taking on side gigs. Cutting back on expenses. And the government. It keeps borrowing. Keeps spending. Keeps inflating. Because as long as people don't revolt, the system works. Now, let's talk about the fifth tool. Financial repression. This is a term most people have never heard. But it's one of the most powerful weapons in the government's arsenal. Here's what it means. Financial repression is when the government manipulates interest rates and regulations to force savers to subsidize government debt. Let me break that down. In a normal, free market, interest rates are determined by supply and demand. If the government wants to borrow money, it has to offer a competitive rate. If inflation is 5%, investors want at least 5% interest, or they lose money in real terms. But what if the government keeps interest rates artificially low? What if they pay 2% interest, while inflation is running at 4%? Then investors are losing 2% per year in real terms. But here's the trick. If you're a bank, a pension fund, or an insurance company, You're often required by law to hold government bonds. You don't have a choice. So even if the interest rate is below inflation, you still have to buy them. That's financial repression. You're being forced to lend money to the government at a loss. And who pays for that loss? Again, it's you. Because banks pass those losses on to customers. Pension funds deliver lower returns. Insurance companies raise premiums. Everyone downstream suffers. But the government gets to borrow cheaply. And the real value of the debt shrinks. This has been happening for over a decade. Ever since the 2008 financial crisis. Interest rates have been kept artificially low. First at 0. Then near 0. And even now, after the Fed raised rates. Real interest rates are still negative in many cases. That's not an accident. That's policy. And it's incredibly effective at reducing debt burdens. Because if you can borrow at 3%, and inflation is running at 4%, you're effectively being paid to borrow. The real cost of your debt is negative. And that's exactly what the US government has been doing. Borrowing trillions. At rates lower than inflation. And watching the real burden of that debt shrink every year. It's genius, really. If you're the government. But if you're a saver, a retiree, or someone trying to build wealth, it's a disaster. Because your money is losing value faster than it's growing. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't opt out. You can't escape. The system is designed to transfer wealth from savers to borrowers. And the biggest borrower of all is the government. So the sixth tool, asset inflation. This one's subtle. But it's maybe the most important. Here's how it works. When the Fed prints money and buys assets, it doesn't just increase the money supply. It drives up the price of assets. Stocks go up. Real estate goes up. Bonds go up. Everything inflates. Now, on the surface, that sounds great. If you own a house, you feel richer. If you own stocks, your portfolio grows. But here's the catch. Asset inflation doesn't help everyone equally. If you own assets, you benefit. If you don't, you get left behind. And guess who owns most of the assets? The wealthy. The top 10% own 90% of stocks. The top 1% own a huge chunk of real estate. So when the Fed inflates asset prices, it makes the rich richer. And it makes inequality worse. But here's why the government does it anyway. Because asset inflation creates the illusion of prosperity. Stock market hits all-time highs. Home values soar. People feel wealthier. Even if their wages aren't going up. Even if their cost of living is rising. The wealth effect keeps people calm. It keeps them spending. It keeps the economy humming. And it gives the government cover to keep borrowing. Because as long as the stock market is up, people assume everything is fine. They don't riot. They don't demand change. They just keep working, keep spending, keep playing the game. And meanwhile, the debt keeps growing. But nobody cares. Because their 401k is up. This is the brilliance of the system. It's designed to distract you. To make you focus on the gains in your portfolio. While ignoring the losses in your purchasing power. You feel like you're winning, but in real terms, you're losing. Because the cost of everything is going up faster than your wealth. Housing is unaffordable. Education is unaffordable. Healthcare is unaffordable. But hey, your stocks are up 20%. So it's all good, right? Wrong. This is the illusion they want you to believe. And it works. For now. But there's a limit to how long you can inflate assets before something breaks. Before bubbles burst. Before people realize the emperor has no clothes. And when that happens, when the market crashes, or when people lose faith in the system, that's when things get dangerous. That's when the seventh tool comes into play. Crisis as opportunity. Let me explain. Every financial crisis creates an opportunity for the government to reset the rules. 2008 financial crisis? The Fed got unprecedented power. Quantitative easing became normalized. Banks got bailouts. 2020 pandemic, trillions in stimulus. Direct payments to citizens. Money printing on a scale never imagined. Each crisis expands the government's toolkit. Each crisis shifts the Overton window of what's acceptable. Things that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago are now standard policy. Negative interest rates, debt monetization, universal basic income pilots. And here's the key. The next crisis will give the government even more power, more tools to manage the debt, more justification for radical policies. Maybe it's a financial crash. Maybe it's a geopolitical shock. Maybe it's a cyber attack that freezes the banking system. Whatever it is, the response will be swift, and it will involve even more money printing, even more debt accumulation, but also even more control. Because that's what crises do. They give governments permission to do things they couldn't do in normal times. And the US is counting on that. They're counting on the next crisis to give them the cover they need. To launch a digital dollar. To revalue gold. To restructure the debt. To fundamentally reset the system. And when it happens, most people will cheer. Because it'll be framed as a rescue. As salvation. As the only way to avoid total collapse. But what it really is the final step in erasing the debt. Not by paying it back, but by changing the rules of the game entirely. So where does that leave us? Let's zoom out and look at the big picture. The US has $38 trillion in debt, and it's not going to pay it back in any traditional sense. Instead, it's using a combination of strategies. Inflation to erode the real value. Gold revaluation to boost assets. Crypto positioning to hedge against dollar decline. Off-balance sheet tricks to hide liabilities. Financial repression to force savers to subsidize borrowing. Asset inflation to create the illusion of wealth. And crisis as cover for radical policy changes. Together, these tools form a comprehensive playbook. A playbook designed to let the US manage its debt, without ever admitting default, without ever saying, "We can't pay." It's a slow-motion restructuring, and most people won't even realize it's happening, until it's already done. Now, does this mean the US is doomed? No. In fact, the US might pull this off. It has advantages no other country has. It controls the world's reserve currency. It has the most powerful military. It has the largest economy. It has a legal system that protects property rights. It has innovation, technology, and human capital. All of that buys time. All of that gives the US room to maneuver. But it doesn't eliminate the risk. Because every empire that's tried this eventually pushed too far, eventually lost credibility, eventually faced a reckoning. Rome fell. The British Empire declined. The Soviet Union collapsed. History is littered with superpowers that thought they were invincible, until they weren't. And the US is playing the same game, betting that it can manage the debt, betting that the dollar will remain dominant, betting that technology and innovation will keep the economy growing fast enough to outrun the debt. But what if it can't? What if inflation gets out of control? What if foreign creditors stop buying US debt? What if a financial crisis spirals into something worse? What if people lose faith in the system? Then all bets are off. Then we're looking at a true collapse. Not just economic, but social, political. A collapse that reshapes the world order. And here's the scariest part. We're closer to that edge than most people realize. The debt-to-GDP ratio is over 120%. That's higher than it was after World War II. Interest payments on the debt are now over $1 trillion per year. That's more than the defense budget. More than we spend on education, infrastructure, or anything else. Just interest. On money we've already borrowed. And as interest rates stay elevated, that number is only going to grow. At some point, it becomes unsustainable. At some point, the math doesn't work anymore. And that's when the reset happens. Not because the government chooses it, but because the market forces it. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying this is happening tomorrow, or next year, or even in the next 5 years. But the trajectory is clear. The US is on a path. And that path leads to one of two places. Either a managed reset, where the government successfully navigates the transition to a new monetary system. A system based on digital dollars, gold backing, or some hybrid model. A system where the debt is effectively erased through accounting, inflation, and asset revaluation. And life goes on. Just with a lot less purchasing power for the middle class. An unmanaged collapse, where the system breaks before the reset can happen. Where faith in the dollar evaporates. Where interest rates spike. Where the government loses control. And where the social and economic fallout is catastrophic. Which one happens depends on a lot of factors. Some are within the government's control. Some aren't. But either way, you need to understand what's happening, because it affects you. It affects your savings, your retirement, your future, and the decisions you make today will determine whether you're protected or exposed. So what can you do? Let's talk about that. Because this isn't just about understanding the problem. It's about positioning yourself for what's coming. First, recognize that cash is not king. Holding dollars in a savings account is one of the worst things you can do right now. Because inflation is eating away at the value every single day. If you're earning 1% in a savings account, and inflation is 4%, you're losing 3% per year. That's a guaranteed loss. So you need to get your money into assets that hold value. Real assets, real estate, commodities, precious metals, things that can't be inflated away. Second, consider gold. I know. Gold doesn't pay interest. It doesn't generate cash flow. It just sits there. But that's the point. Gold is insurance. It's a hedge against currency debasement. And if the US is moving toward a gold-backed or gold-revalued system, then owning gold means you're aligned with the reset. You're not fighting the current. You're riding it. Third, understand crypto. You don't have to be a Bitcoin maximalist. You don't have to believe it's the future of all money. But you should have some exposure. Because if the US is positioning itself in the crypto space, then crypto is going to be part of the new system. Whether that's Bitcoin, stablecoins, or a central bank digital currency. Digital assets are here to stay. And having a foothold in that world gives you optionality. Fourth, diversify internationally. Don't keep all your eggs in the US basket. Look at foreign stocks, foreign real estate, foreign currencies. If the dollar declines, you want assets that aren't denominated in dollars. That way, you're not entirely dependent on the US system. Fifth, invest in skills and knowledge. This is the most important one. Because no matter what happens to the financial system, skills are valuable. Knowledge is valuable. The ability to create value, solve problems, and adapt. That's what will carry you through any crisis. So don't just focus on where to put your money. Focus on becoming more valuable as a person. Learn new skills. Build your network. Stay curious. Stay adaptable. Because in a world where the rules are changing, the people who thrive are the ones who can change with them. Part 6. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Is what the US is doing ethical? Is it fair? Or is it just a massive theft from savers and the middle class? Here's the honest answer. It's both. From the government's perspective, they're doing what's necessary. They're managing an impossible situation. They're trying to avoid default, economic collapse, and social chaos. And if that means inflating away the debt, if that means eroding savings, if that means transferring wealth from one group to another, then that's the price of stability. But from your perspective, it's theft. You worked for your money. You saved it. You planned for the future. And now, through no fault of your own, that money is worth less. Your purchasing power is declining. Your standard of living is under threat. And there's nothing you can do to stop it, because the game is rigged. The rules are written by the people in power. And those rules benefit the insiders, the people who own assets, the people who control the system, not the people who work for a living. So yeah, it's unfair. But that's how power works. That's how it's always worked. Throughout history, those in control have used the system to benefit themselves. And those without power have paid the price. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to stay blind? Keep your money in cash? Trust that the system will work out? Or are you going to wake up, educate yourself, position yourself, and take control of your financial future? Because the system isn't going to save you. The government isn't going to protect you. You have to protect yourself. And that starts with understanding what's really happening, which is exactly why you're here, watching this video, learning the truth. And that's the first step. But it can't be the last. You have to act. You have to make changes. You have to adapt. Because the reset is coming, whether we like it or not. And when it happens, there will be winners and losers. The winners will be the people who saw it coming, who positioned themselves in real assets, who understood the game, who played it smart. The losers will be the people who ignored the signs, who kept their money in cash, who trusted the system to take care of them, who woke up too late. Don't be one of the losers. Don't let this moment pass you by. Because moments like this, moments of massive financial transition, they're rare. They happen once in a generation, maybe once in a century, and they create opportunities, huge opportunities, for those who are prepared. Think about the people who bought gold in the 1970s before it exploded. Think about the people who bought real estate after the 2008 crash. Think about the early Bitcoin adopters. They saw the writing on the wall. They acted, and they were rewarded, not because they were lucky, but because they were paying attention, because they understood the macro trends, because they were willing to go against the crowd. And that's what you need to do now. Go against the crowd. Stop listening to the mainstream narratives. Stop trusting that everything is fine, because it's not. And the people who realize that early are the ones who come out ahead. Now, I'm not saying you should panic. I'm not saying you should sell everything and move to a bunker. But I am saying you should take this seriously. You should start preparing. Start diversifying. Start protecting your wealth. Because the $38 trillion debt isn't going away. And the strategies the US is using to manage it are going to affect you, whether you understand them or not, whether you believe in them or not. They're happening right now, behind closed doors, in Federal Reserve meetings, in Treasury Department briefings, in classified discussions about monetary policy. The pieces are being moved. The board is being set, and the game is already underway. The only question is, are you a player, or are you a pawn? Look, we've covered a lot in this video. Inflation as a stealth tax, gold revaluation as a hidden weapon, crypto as strategic positioning, off-balance sheet accounting tricks, financial repression forcing savers to pay, asset inflation creating illusions of wealth, crisis as the ultimate tool for resetting the rules. These aren't theories. These aren't conspiracies. These are real mechanisms being used right now by the most powerful government on earth to quietly erase $38 trillion in debt. And they're doing it while you're distracted by politics, by social media, by the daily noise of life. But now you know. Now you see the bigger picture. And that knowledge gives you power. The power to act. the power to protect yourself, the power to position yourself for what's coming. So here's my final challenge to you. Don't just watch this video and move on. Don't just nod your head and forget about it tomorrow. Take action. Start today. Look at your finances. Look at your assets. Ask yourself, am I positioned for a world where the dollar is worth less? Am I ready for inflation to stay elevated? Do I have real assets that hold value? Am I diversified enough? If the answer is no, then start making changes. Because time is running out. Not in a dramatic, apocalyptic sense, but in a slow, grinding, inevitable sense. The debt is growing. The tools are being deployed. The reset is in motion. And the best time to prepare was yesterday. The second best time is right now. So take this seriously. Educate yourself further. Watch the next video in this series where we dive even deeper into how you can personally protect your wealth in this new era. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think the US can actually pull off this reset? Or are we headed for collapse? I want to hear your thoughts. Because this conversation matters. This moment matters. And your future depends on how you respond to it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being curious. Thank you for seeking the truth. Stay sharp. Stay informed. And I'll see you in the next video.